Well, good morning. It's a new week in our class on experimental research. So it's February 20th. You'll start by reading a couple of things ongoing for this week. You'll read chapters 9 and 10 on causal comparative research and experimental research. And then you'll do the quizzes, of course, for both of those two chapters as well this week. And then finally, for the activities, there's a proposal description due this week. So that's the next assignment. And so it says complete either task 2A or 2B from the textbook. 2A is for students that are looking into doing a quantitative study for their research proposal, and task 2B is for students desiring to do a qualitative study. Information on what to do for this task can be found on page 114 of the textbook. There's also an example task in the textbook. But the assignment should include the following items. You'll have an introduction, a statement of the problem, a review of the literature, but that is just put your finished preliminary review of the literature here. So I don't really have to grade that, you've already got that. And then a statement of the hypothesis. So you're really adding just those three sections: introduction, statement of the problem, and statement of hypothesis. And then you'll be graded according to the rubric. It looks at the introduction, whether that adequately introduces the paper and study, and connects the study to previous work with citations of other literature. Some of you may have already written this introduction. If you think about it, you've got an introduction to your review of the literature, right? So you might just have to tweak that a little bit and make it an introduction to your study or your proposal study that you want to propose. Now remember, with your proposal description and with all of your assignments this semester, you don't have to collect data. You go up to the point where you would collect data, but you don't actually collect data and conduct your study for this class. You can do that later, but it's not required for this class. So you're just going to propose a study. You're going to propose one that you can do, or it's possible to do. It's not really fictional, but you're not actually going to conduct it and collect the data or do the interviews or run the survey like a real research study would be. You just have to prepare everything up to that point. So that's something to be aware of. And then it looks for a statement of the problem. This presents the areas to be studied in this proposal. So for instance, some of you are talking about standards-based grading. So maybe the problem is that we don't know whether standards-based grading is a better way of grading than traditional methods of grading. And so that might be your statement of problem. You might talk about how there's not enough research out there yet that shares whether standards-based grading is better than another traditional form of grading, so we need more research in this area. That's the problem, and so of course your study is going to look at that. Or maybe it's a vertical jump, so you might say, well, the problem is athletes don't have good equipment in order to do the traditional methods of gaining power for vertical jump, so therefore we need to investigate other methods of increasing athletes' vertical jump. Whatever it is the problem. And then it looks at the statement of hypothesis as well. Notice that it doesn't look so much at the review of the literature, and that's because I've already reviewed your review of literature. So the statement of a hypothesis presents a clear statement of what outcome is expected from the study. In other words, you will say exactly what you think will happen as a result of your proposed study. What will be the outcome of the study? So for standards-based grading, you might state a hypothesis that you expect that standards-based grading will show, based on your study, will show better student achievement or better student motivation, or whatever it is you want it to show. That's what you're going to state, and you have to make that very clear what you want the outcome of your study to be. Or with athletes, you might say, well, I want the athletes, I expect that the athletes will perform better with these different types of exercises that I'm proposing in my study. So that's a clear statement of what you expect to happen from the study. And then it looks for other things like document APA format, proper APA for in-text and references, and then proposal description flowing well with organizing sentences and paragraphs. And I have included an example proposal description here, right underneath where the assignment is due. And this is a good example. This is the one about teacher mentoring, and it gives a nice introduction to the topic. Shares the statement of the problem. The problem in this case is that teachers are under tremendous pressure, and then there's a lot of teacher attrition, or teachers leaving the field early in their years. And then it has the review of related literature, which is just a copy and paste of a preliminary literature review of that student. And then finally, at the very end, you see the statement of hypothesis. It says, if mentoring is done correctly, the staff will benefit from the program. Strong mentoring is hypothesized to help new teachers stay in the profession. Okay, so that's a clear statement. Maybe it could be even clearer, but it's a clear statement of what they expect to happen. If they implement mentoring programs, they expect that teachers will stay in the profession. So that's an example proposal review or proposal description, and you'll need to submit that by the end of this week to me as well as we continue on. Now I do want to encourage you to think about qualitative versus quantitative research. Again, you have to pick, right, for this proposal description, whether your research is qualitative or quantitative. So qualitative, remember, or quantitative, I'll start with that, is the type of research that is numeric. It yields numeric data. So usually even surveys, if you're going to do survey research, will yield numeric data that you're going to calculate into some kind of answers. Or an experiment where you have test scores, or all of the research methods that we've been talking about so far, experimental, survey, and correlational, and then even next week's on single subject experimental research, all of those are quantitative. They're all numerical. Later on, we'll talk about qualitative methods such as narrative and ethnographic research and case study research. And those are qualitative. Now, qualitative is the type of research where you are collecting data that is not numeric. It's more about feelings or experiences with a different program or a phenomenon. And so that type of data comes from interviews and observations rather than surveys or questionnaires or scores. So again, qualitative is interviews and observations. Quantitative is collecting scores or questionnaires, surveys, and those kinds of things. So just be aware of that and which type of study that you want to do. Now at this point, if you haven't quite decided yet, pick one for this assignment, but you can still change after you submit your proposal description from one to the other if you want to. But after this and before the next assignment is when you'll really have to nail it down which one you're going to do. And I do encourage you to do one or the other, not both, because both is confusing and this is your first chance to do some research. So I want you to be able to keep it simple. And also a reminder that there is a final literature review due later in the semester. Not now, but later in the semester you'll have a final literature review. So keep reading articles in your area. Keep finding research report articles. That means that you're reading a report from the person who actually conducted a research study within your area. Those will help you a lot more than just a secondary source, which is a review or an article that advances a certain theory. Find research reports. Find things that have a methods section in them. That's one way to tell that you have a research report, is if there's a methods section where they explain what their method was for the experiment that they ran or the study that they did. So make sure you do that. Keep reading those, as that literature review that comes up will require a lot more sources than the preliminary one. I think it's 15 that you have to have at least. Also, a reminder for all students, don't refer to yourself in the proposal or literature reviews that you do. Don't put "I felt like this" or "my group did this" or "my experience has been this." Instead, I just want to hear what the research says. So that's important, to leave out statements about yourself or about your own experience as you write a proposal or as you write for this proposal description assignment or for your literature reviews. Leave those out. Instead, you're just going to tell me what the research says and explain the situation without referring to yourself. That's something you want to do. And so those are the activities for this week. I want to give just a quick little primer on some of the different types of research you're learning about this week. The first one is causal comparative research, and basically this is a research that determines the cause for existing differences. So you don't manipulate anything. You're not going to take one group and manipulate that group and take another group and change that group. Instead, you are just finding existing differences between two groups of people and trying to determine the cause for them. So one good example is actually that teacher mentoring study that I mentioned, because again, you have teachers who may be leaving the field, and maybe you have other groups that are not leaving the field. Maybe they're staying as teachers for a long time. And you want to determine the cause for those differences, and so you might hypothesize then that mentoring makes the difference. And so you might make a study where you try to figure out whether those teachers who left the field had mentors or not. And if it turns out that teachers who stayed in the field did have mentors and teachers who left the field tended not to have mentors, well, then you found something kind of interesting. That's causal comparative research. It looks back at things retrospectively. So it starts with an effect and seeks to find a cause, and then you might select groups that are different, then attempt to determine the cause of the difference. Another example might be that you find a group with chronic lung cancer, or a group that has a lot of mental or maybe physical illness, and another group that does not. And then you might try to find the cause for that. You might go back and say, well, these people are smokers. Maybe there's some connection there. There's this group of people who had great health tend to avoid smoking. So you look back on that. Obviously, it's not something you want to manipulate. You're not going to make a group of people smoke to find out if it leads to bad health. That would be unethical. So that's why we do causal comparative research. So let's see. So the independent variable is not manipulated by the researcher in this case. And let me think about what other things we want to look at. And with causal comparative research, though, it's not as strong as experimental research. And so that's why I have this aliens guy up here. So you have to interpret the results with a little bit of caution. Experimental research is the strongest type of research, and it allows us to make stronger causal inferences. Causal inferences just basically means I know that this caused this because I manipulated it myself in an experiment, not just causal comparative research, but an actual experiment. So with causal comparative research, you have to interpret the results with caution. Well, you'll be reading a little bit more about causal comparative research as we go along. But with experimental research, it's a little bit different here. In experimental research, you can find cause and effect relationships. It's the strongest way to do so because you, as the researcher, manipulate an independent variable. Meaning you're the one who takes a group of people and randomly selects them to two different conditions maybe, and then you manipulate one experience for one group and leave the experience for the other group different. And then you measure it, and you try to control other variables that might end up messing things up, right? But you can control the selection and assignment in experimental research, so you can make the strongest cause and effect relationship claims based on experimental research. It's the most generalizable research as well. And so if you think about it, you have two groups in experimental research. I'll show you a few examples here. Let's see. And there are different threats and so forth. You'll be reading about a lot of these things. So here's one design, the pretest post-test control group design. So you might randomly assign, let's say there are two groups. Let's say this is an example of students in a different type of classroom. So you have a random assignment of students to different classes, let's say, or different experiences. And then you pretest their pre-knowledge on something. And then the control group receives more of a traditional instruction, while the experimental or treatment group might have some instruction with some technology. And you have randomly assigned and you've manipulated that so that one group gets one treatment and another group gets another. And then you post-test it to find out, which group improved the most in their learning. That is an experimental research example, and that's probably the most classic one here, the pretest post-test control group design. And that's an example of making the strongest causal inferences because you have randomly assigned people to the different groups and you have manipulated what treatments or what experiences the different groups get. And then on your post-test, if you find that the experimental group really did a lot better, you can make a strong inference that that's the way that people should teach students. So that's just an example of experimental research, and you'll learn more as you read this week. Have a great week.